3 years ago, what should have been the perfect summer holiday for a father and his twin daughters turned into every family's worst nightmare when 16-year-old Emma and Lily Chen vanished without a trace during their camping trip in the Rocky Mountains. But for 3 agonizing years, authorities searched desperately, following every lead and chasing every possible clue until hope began to fade and the case grew cold. But then their older brother Marcus made a discovery that would shatter everything the family believed about that tragic day, and what he revealed would expose a truth so shocking that it would change their lives forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floors of the Chen family home in Boulder, Colorado, as Marcus Chen sat rigidly in his father's old leather armchair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Detective Sarah Mitchell sat across from him in the living room that had once been filled with the laughter of his twin sisters, but now felt hollow and empty, like a museum of memories. Frozen in time, the detective's expression was grave as she delivered news that Marcus had been dreading for months. "Mr. Chen, I'm afraid we've reached a difficult point in your sister's case." She began, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years of failed investigations and false hopes. "We've exhausted every possible lead, followed up on hundreds of tips, and searched thousands of square miles of wilderness, but we're running out of resources, and frankly, we're running out of hope." Marcus felt his chest tighten as he stared at the detective who had become almost like family over the past 3 years. Detective Mitchell had been there through every breakthrough and every devastating disappointment she had held his mother, while she sobbed after yet another false sighting had led nowhere, and she had personally coordinated search efforts that had involved hundreds of volunteers and multiple law enforcement agencies. But now, at 24 years old, Marcus could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the same exhaustion he saw in his own reflection every morning when he looked in the mirror. "Detective," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't give up on them. They're out there somewhere, I know they are, Emma. And Lily, they wouldn't just disappear. They were smart girls, responsible girls. Something happened to them, something terrible, and someone knows what it is." The detective leaned forward in her chair, her expression softening with the kind of compassion that comes from years of delivering devastating news to families in crisis. "Marcus, I understand your determination, and I admire how you've never given up hope, but you have to understand our position. We've received over 2,000 tips in the past 3 years. We've followed up on sightings in 47 states and 3 different countries. We've interviewed everyone who was at that campground the week your sisters disappeared. We've searched caves, rivers, abandoned buildings, and remote wilderness areas with search dogs, helicopters, and ground-penetrating radar. We've consulted with the FBI Missing Persons Unit and even brought in psychics when your parents requested it, but every single lead has turned into a dead end." Marcus stood up abruptly and walked to the mantelpiece, where dozens of family photos chronicled happier times. There was Emma and Lily on their 16th birthday, just 2 months before they disappeared, their identical faces beaming with joy as they blew out candles on the chocolate cake their mother had spent hours decorating. There was their family vacation to Yellowstone the previous summer, where the twins had insisted on taking selfies with every geyser and wildlife sign they could find, and there in the center was the last photo ever taken of his sisters, standing beside their father's blue Toyota 4Runner on the morning they left for what was supposed to be a 5-day camping adventure in Rocky Mountain National Park. They looked so excited, so full of life, so completely unaware that they would never come home. Detective Mitchell watched Marcus carefully as he touched the frame of that final photograph, his finger tracing the outline of Emma's face. Then Lily's. The twins had been inseparable since birth, finishing each other's sentences, sharing clothes, and friends and dreams for the future. Emma wanted to be a veterinarian, while Lily dreamed of becoming a park ranger so they could work with animals and nature together forever. The irony that Lily had vanished in the very wilderness she loved. So much was not lost on anyone in the family, Marcus. I know this is incredibly difficult to accept, the detective continued, but we have to be realistic about the resources we can allocate to this case. There are other missing persons cases that require our attention, and with no new evidence or leads emerging, we simply cannot justify the manpower we've been dedicating to Emma and Lily's disappearance. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, and he gripped the mantelpiece to steady himself as a wave of anger and desperation washed over him. How can you say that, he demanded, his voice rising with each word. These are my sisters we're talking about, not just another case file. They were 16 years old, Detective, 16. They had their whole lives ahead of them. Emma was supposed to start her senior year this fall. She was already looking at colleges with good veterinary programs, and Lily had been accepted into an advanced wilderness survival course. She was so excited about it. She talked about it every day for weeks before they left. And now you're telling me that you're just going to give up on them, that you're going to let whoever took them get away with it. Detective Mitchell stood up and approached Marcus, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. I'm not saying we're giving up entirely. Marcus, if new evidence emerges, or if someone comes forward with credible information, we will absolutely pursue it. But after 3 years of intensive investigation, we have to acknowledge that the chances of finding Emma and Lily alive are becoming increasingly slim. Most missing persons cases that remain unsolved after the first 48 hours become exponentially more difficult to resolve, and your sisters have been missing for over 1,000 days. The statistical reality is harsh, but we cannot ignore it any longer. The detective paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. I came here today to discuss transitioning the case from active investigation to cold case status, which means we would no longer have dedicated resources assigned to it full-time, but it would remain open, and any new developments would be investigated. Marcus turned to face the detective, his eyes blazing with determination that had only grown stronger over the past 3 years. Detective Mitchell, with all due respect, I don't give a damn about your statistics. Emma and Lily are not statistics. They're my baby sisters, and I will never stop looking for them, even if every law enforcement agency in the country gives up. I will keep searching until I find out what happened to them, or until the day I die. He walked over to a large map of Colorado that covered most of one wall. The map was covered with dozens of colored pins, marking every location that had been searched, every tip that had been investigated, every possible clue that had been pursued. The sheer scope of the search effort was overwhelming to look at, but Marcus knew every single pin represented hours of desperate hope, followed by crushing disappointment. The detective studied the map with professional interest, noting the meticulous organization and the incredible dedication it represented. Marcus, you and your family have been through an unimaginable ordeal, and your commitment to finding Emma and Lily has been extraordinary, but I'm concerned about your well-being and your parents' well-being. You've put your own life on hold for 3 years. You dropped out of graduate school. You ended your engagement to Sarah. You've spent your inheritance from your grandmother on private investigators and search efforts, and your parents have mortgaged their home twice to fund the investigation. At some point, you have to consider whether this level of obsession is healthy or sustainable. She gestured toward a stack of missing person flyers on the coffee table, each bearing the smiling faces of Emma and Lily. How many of these have you distributed over the years? How many hours have you spent standing outside grocery stores and gas stations, showing their photos to strangers? Marcus looked at the flyers and felt a familiar ache in his chest. He had indeed distributed thousands of them, driving to neighboring states, posting them on bulletin boards in truck stops, libraries, community centers, and anywhere else people might see them. He had created social media campaigns that had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. He had appeared on local news programs and even a national morning show pleading for information about his missing sisters. He had hired 3 different private investigators, spending over $70,000 of his own money chasing leads that had ultimately led nowhere. And through it all, he had never lost faith that Emma and Lily were out there somewhere, waiting for him to find them. But as Marcus looked at Detective Mitchell's concerned expression, he realized that perhaps his faith was beginning to waver. Not his belief that his sisters were alive, but his confidence in his ability to find them. The weight of 3 years of failure was crushing, and for the first time since that terrible August morning when his father had called him sobbing and barely coherent to tell him that Emma and Lily were missing, Marcus began to wonder if he was fighting a battle he could never win. The thought terrified him because if he gave up hope, who else would keep looking for his sisters? Their parents had already begun talking about holding a memorial service and moving forward with their lives as much as possible. But Marcus had refused to even consider such a thing. Detective Mitchell seemed to sense his internal struggle, and her voice became even gentler. "Marcus, I want to ask you to do something for me, and I want you to really think about it. Before you answer, can you walk me through exactly what happened that day, one more time from the beginning?" Sometimes when we revisit the details after time has passed, we might notice something we missed before or make connections that weren't obvious. Initially, I know you've told this story countless times, to police officers, FBI agents, reporters, and private investigators. But humor me one more time and tell me everything you remember about the days leading up to the camping trip and that morning when they left. Marcus nodded slowly and moved to sit back down in his father's chair. The familiar ritual of recounting the events of that final weekend was both painful and oddly comforting, like picking at a scab that never quite healed. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to summon the memories with perfect clarity, because he knew that somewhere in those details might be the key to understanding what had really happened to Emma and Lily on that beautiful August morning when they had driven away with their father toward the mountains, never to be seen again. Before we dive deeper into this heartbreaking story that has captivated our community, let us know where you're watching from today, whether you're joining us from Colorado, where this tragedy unfolded, or from anywhere else around the world. Your support means everything to families like the Chens, who refuse to give up hope. And if this story moves you, or if you believe in never giving up on the people we love, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because stories like these need to be heard and shared so that missing loved ones are never forgotten, and so that the truth, no matter how long it takes to surface, will always find a way to come to light. Marcus took a deep breath and settled back into the worn leather of his father's chair, the same chair where David Chen had sat every evening after work, reading bedtime stories to Emma and Lily when they were little girls with pigtails and gap-toothed smiles, who believed their big brother could solve any problem and protect them from any danger in the world. The irony was not lost on Marcus that he was now sitting in that same chair 3 years later, completely powerless to bring his sisters home or even to understand what had happened to them on what should have been a routine family camping trip in the Colorado wilderness that they had visited dozens of times before without incident. Detective Mitchell pulled out a digital recorder and placed it on the coffee table between them, along with a thick manila folder that Marcus recognized as Emma and Lily's case file. The folder had grown substantially over the past 3 years, filled with witness statements, search reports, forensic analyses, and hundreds of tips from well-meaning strangers who thought they had seen the twins in locations ranging from Denver to Albuquerque to as far away as Seattle and Phoenix. Each tip had been investigated thoroughly, and each one had ultimately led to disappointment. But Marcus appreciated that Detective Mitchell had never dismissed any lead, no matter how unlikely it seemed, because desperate families cling to even the faintest possibility of hope. The detective opened the folder and pulled out several photographs that Marcus had seen countless times before, crime scene photos of the abandoned campsite where Emma and Lily had last been seen, along with their father David Chen, who had also vanished without a trace that August morning, leaving behind only questions and a family torn apart by grief and uncertainty. "Marcus, I know this is difficult," the detective said gently, "but I need you to start from the beginning. Tell me about the days leading up to the camping trip. Was this something that was planned in advance, or was it a spontaneous decision? And were there any unusual circumstances or conversations that stood out to you as strange or concerning?" Marcus nodded and began to speak, his voice steady, despite the emotional weight of the memories. It wasn't spontaneous at all. "Detective, this was something Dad had been planning for months. Ever since Emma and Lily turned 16 in June, he kept saying that this might be one of the last summers before they got too busy with jobs and boyfriends and college preparations to want to spend time camping with their old man. He was really looking forward to it, actually. He had been researching different trails and campsites for weeks, making lists of supplies and activities he thought the girls would enjoy. Dad was always very organized about these family trips. He never left anything to chance." The detective made notes as Marcus spoke, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details, and Marcus found himself remembering things he had forgotten or perhaps deliberately pushed from his mind because they were too painful to contemplate. Emma had been excited about the trip, but also a little reluctant, because she had been invited to a pool party that same weekend by Jake Morrison, a boy she had been crushing on since freshman year, and Lily had teased her mercilessly about choosing family time over potential romance. But in the end, Emma had decided that she could see Jake anytime, but camping trips with Dad were special and becoming less frequent as they got older. Marcus remembered how proud their father had been when Emma made that choice. David Chen had always prioritized family time above everything else, even working extra shifts at the electronics store he managed so that he could afford to take his children on adventures that would create lasting memories. He had grown up poor, in a family where vacations were impossible luxuries, and he was determined that his own children would have experiences he had never been able to enjoy as a boy there. There was something almost desperate about his commitment to these family outings, as if he knew instinctively that time was running out and that his daughters were growing up too fast. Detective Mitchell leaned forward slightly, her pen poised over her notepad. "What about the specific campsite they chose? Was this somewhere your family had been before, or was it a new location? And do you know why your father selected that particular area?" Marcus thought for a moment, trying to recall the conversations he had overheard. In the weeks leading up to the trip, Dad had chosen Willow Creek Campground because it was relatively isolated but still had basic facilities like restrooms and fire pits. He liked places where they could experience real wilderness without being completely cut off from civilization in case of emergencies. Plus, Emma and Lily had been there twice before when they were younger, so they were familiar with the hiking trails and the layout of the campground. The detective made more notes and then pulled out a map of Rocky Mountain National Park with various locations marked in different colored ink. Marcus could see that Willow Creek Campground was circled in red, with several other nearby locations marked as well, indicating the extensive search efforts that had been conducted in the months following the disappearance. "Now, Marcus, I need you to think carefully about the morning they left. Can you remember any details about their departure time, what they packed, who they spoke to before leaving, and whether there were any last-minute changes to their plans?" Marcus closed his eyes and transported himself back to that August morning. 3 years ago, the memory was crystal clear because it had been replayed in his mind thousands of times, like a movie scene he could never escape. Dad was up early, around 6 in the morning, loading the Toyota with camping gear, sleeping bags, coolers full of food, and all the supplies they would need for 5 days in the wilderness. Emma and Lily didn't get up until almost 8, which was typical for them on weekends. But once they were awake, they were excited, chattering about the hikes they wanted to take and the wildlife they hoped to see. Lily had brought her new camera that she had saved up to buy with money from her summer job at the local animal shelter. The detective interrupted gently. What about their cell phones? Did they have them with them? And were there any communications after they left? Marcus felt his stomach clench as he remembered this particular detail, which had been crucial to the early stages of the investigation. They all had their phones with them, and Dad had texted me around 9:30 that morning to let me know they had stopped for gas and snacks in Estes Park and were making good time to the campground. That was the last communication anyone in our family received from any of them. After that, their phones either died or went out of service range, which wasn't unusual in that area of the mountains, but it meant we had no way to track their movements or communicate with them. Detective Mitchell nodded grimly. This detail had been particularly frustrating for investigators because it meant there was no digital trail to follow, no GPS data or cell tower pings that could help reconstruct the family's movements after they reached the more remote areas of the national park. It was as if they had simply driven into the wilderness and vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of their passage or their fate. The detective pulled out another photograph, this one showing David Chen's blue Toyota 4Runner, which had been found 3 days after they were reported missing, parked at the Willow Creek campground trailhead, with all of their camping gear still inside, untouched. Marcus stared at the photograph, feeling the familiar wave of confusion and frustration that had plagued him for 3 years. The fact that all of their supplies were still in the vehicle made no sense. If they had gone hiking, why hadn't they taken water bottles or snacks or basic safety equipment with them? If they had been abducted from the campsite, why hadn't there been signs of a struggle? And why would kidnappers leave behind expensive camping equipment that could have been sold for significant money? The abandoned vehicle raised more questions than it answered and had become one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire case. Detective Mitchell seemed to read his thoughts as she continued her questioning. Marcus, what did the initial search efforts reveal, and how quickly were authorities notified when your family failed to return home as scheduled? Marcus rubbed his temples where a familiar headache was beginning to form. Mom expected them back on Tuesday evening, August 15th, but when they didn't show up by bedtime, she wasn't immediately concerned because Dad sometimes extended trips if the weather was good and the girls were having fun. But when they hadn't returned or called by Wednesday morning, she started getting worried and tried calling their phones repeatedly with no success. The detective nodded. This timeline had been established early in the investigation and had been crucial in determining when the search efforts should begin. Your mother contacted park rangers on Wednesday afternoon, and they located the abandoned vehicle by Thursday morning. But by then, your family had potentially been missing for anywhere from 24 to 72 hours, depending on when exactly they disappeared. The delay in reporting and the vast wilderness area they were exploring made the initial search extremely challenging and may have cost precious time when immediate action could have made a difference. Marcus felt the weight of those lost hours pressing down on his chest like a physical burden. If only Mom had called sooner. If only Dad had checked in more frequently. If only the cell phone coverage in that area had been better. There were so many if-onlys that haunted the entire family and fueled Marcus's determination to never give up searching, because giving up felt like accepting that those crucial early hours had doomed Emma and Lily to a fate that could have been prevented with faster action and better communication. The detective closed the folder and looked directly at Marcus, her expression serious but compassionate. Marcus, I can see that you've thought about every detail of this case obsessively for 3 years, and I want you to know that your dedication to finding your sisters has been extraordinary, but I also want you to consider the possibility that some cases remain unsolved, not because investigators aren't thorough enough or families aren't determined enough, but because the answers simply cannot be found with the evidence and resources available, and sometimes accepting that reality is the only way for families to begin healing and moving forward with their lives. But Marcus shook his head vehemently, his jaw set with stubborn determination that had only grown stronger over the past 3 years. Detective Mitchell, I respect your experience and your expertise, but I will never accept that Emma and Lily's case cannot be solved somewhere out there. Someone knows what happened to my sisters and my father, and I intend to find that someone, no matter how long it takes or how much it costs, because the alternative, accepting that they're gone forever and that their disappearance will remain a mystery, is simply not an option for me. I would rather spend the rest of my life searching than live with the regret of giving up too soon. Marcus Chen had always been the responsible older brother, the one Emma and Lily turned to when they needed help with homework, or advice about boys, or someone to drive them to soccer practice when their parents were working late shifts. But at 24, he felt like he had failed in the most fundamental way possible. He had been unable to protect the two people who mattered most to him in the world, and that failure had consumed every aspect of his life for the past 3 years, transforming him from a promising graduate student in environmental engineering into a hollow shell of a man whose entire existence revolved around a single desperate mission to find his missing sisters. The physical toll of his obsession was evident to anyone who looked closely enough at Marcus Chen. The young man who had once been captain of his college rugby team and known for his infectious laugh and easy confidence had aged decades in just 3 years. His dark hair now showed premature streaks of grey at the temples, and his once athletic frame had become gaunt from too many skipped meals and sleepless nights spent poring over maps and police reports and internet forums dedicated to missing persons cases. His brown eyes, which Emma and Lily had always teased him about, saying they made him look like a puppy dog, now held a haunted quality that made friends and family members uncomfortable because they reflected a pain too deep for words. The emotional transformation had been even more dramatic than the physical changes. Marcus had withdrawn from virtually everyone in his life, including his longtime girlfriend Sarah Martinez, who had tried desperately to support him through the first year of the twins' disappearance, but eventually realized that Marcus was no longer capable of maintaining any relationship that didn't directly relate to finding Emma and Lily. She had begged him to seek counseling, to consider that his mental health was deteriorating, to understand that his sisters would want him to live his own life, even while searching for them. But Marcus had been unable to hear her concerns through the roar of guilt and desperation that filled his head 24 hours a day. Sarah had finally ended their engagement on a cold February evening, 18 months after the twins disappeared. Sitting in the same living room where Marcus now met with Detective Mitchell, she had cried as she explained that she couldn't watch the man she loved destroy himself with an obsession that was consuming his soul, his career, his relationships, and his future. She had said that she would always love him, but that she couldn't be part of his self-destruction anymore, and that she hoped someday he would realize that Emma and Lily would be heartbroken to know that their disappearance had cost Marcus his chance at happiness and a normal life. But Marcus had barely reacted to her departure, because by then nothing mattered except the search. His parents, David and Helen Chen, had watched their only remaining child spiral into a depression so deep that they feared they might lose him too to suicide or a complete mental breakdown. Helen had found Marcus passed out at his computer one morning after he had spent 72 straight hours researching cold cases and missing persons databases, trying to find patterns that might apply to Emma and Lily's situation. And David had discovered that Marcus had maxed out multiple credit cards, hiring private investigators and psychics, and anyone else who claimed they might be able to help locate the twins. The family that had once been close-knit and loving had fractured under the weight of grief and desperation with each member, coping in different ways that seemed to drive them further apart rather than bringing them together. Marcus had dropped out of his master's program at Colorado State University, where he had been studying environmental engineering with a focus on water resource management, a field he had chosen because he wanted to help solve the world's growing water crisis. But after Emma and Lily disappeared, he found it impossible to concentrate on anything as abstract as global problems, when he couldn't even solve the very personal crisis that had devastated his own family. His professors had been understanding at first, offering extensions and incomplete grades, and suggesting he take a leave of absence until he was ready to return. But eventually they had to acknowledge that Marcus was never coming back to finish his degree. The financial cost of Marcus's obsession had been staggering over the past 3 years. He had spent his entire inheritance from his grandmother, who had died 6 months before the twins disappeared, leaving him nearly $50,000 that was supposed to help him buy a house or start his career, but instead had gone to private investigators who promised results they couldn't deliver, to reward funds that generated tips, but no real leads, to traveling expenses for chasing false sightings across multiple states, and to technology and equipment that he believed might help him succeed where law enforcement had failed. His parents had also mortgaged their home twice to fund search efforts and reward money, bringing the total family expenditure to well over $200,000, with nothing to show for it except mounting debt and shattered dreams. The house that had once been filled with laughter and music and the constant chatter of teenage girls planning their futures had become a shrine to Emma and Lily's memory, with missing person posters covering the walls alongside family photographs that served as painful reminders of happier times. Marcus had converted his old bedroom into a command center of sorts, with multiple computers running facial recognition software that scanned social media platforms and news footage, looking for any sign of his sisters. He had created elaborate filing systems to track every tip, every lead, every possible sighting, and had mapped out search grids covering thousands of square miles of wilderness where the twins might be hidden or lost, or worse. Sleep had become Marcus's enemy because dreams brought him face to face with Emma and Lily, who appeared to him as they had been on that last morning, young and excited and completely trusting that their big brother would always be there to protect them. But he would wake up to the crushing reality that he had failed them in the most fundamental way possible, and that 3 years of searching had brought him no closer to understanding what had happened to them or where they might be. The guilt was so overwhelming that Marcus had considered suicide multiple times, but had always pulled back because he knew that if he died, there would be no one left who cared enough to keep searching for his sisters. Detective Mitchell had become one of the few people who still treated Marcus with patience and compassion, rather than the mixture of pity and frustration that he saw in the eyes of former friends and extended family members who thought he should accept reality and move on with his life. She had spent countless hours listening to his theories and following up on his leads, even when she knew they would likely prove fruitless, and she had never once suggested that he was wasting her time or that his obsession was unhealthy, though Marcus could see the concern in her eyes when she looked at him and noticed how much weight he had lost, or how his hands shook from too much caffeine and too little sleep. The detective understood better than most people that families of missing persons often became casualties themselves, unable to move forward with their lives, while trapped in a limbo of uncertainty and false hope. She had seen parents divorce and, Children develop serious mental health problems and entire families torn apart by the stress of not knowing what had happened to their loved one. But she had also seen cases where persistence and refusal to give up had eventually led to answers, and sometimes even to reunions that seemed impossible after years of searching. So she tried to balance realistic expectations with enough encouragement to keep families from completely falling apart. Marcus knew that his behavior had become increasingly erratic, and that people who had once respected and admired him now whispered about his mental state and questioned his judgment. But he couldn't bring himself to care about their opinions because their comfortable assumptions about moving on and accepting loss seemed like luxuries he could never afford. Emma and Lily weren't abstract concepts or statistics. They were real people who had trusted him to protect them and who were depending on him to never stop looking, even if everyone else in the world gave up hope and wrote them off as another unsolved case that would eventually be forgotten by everyone except their family. The isolation had become total and suffocating. Marcus rarely left the house, except to distribute missing person flyers or follow up on tips that came through the various hotlines and websites he had established. He had alienated most of his former friends by constantly steering conversations toward Emma and Lily's disappearance, and by asking everyone he met whether they had seen his sisters or heard anything that might be relevant to the case. His social media accounts had become obsessive chronicles of the search, with daily posts about new leads and theories, and pleas for information that generated sympathy but no useful responses from his dwindling number of online connections. Even his relationship with his parents had become strained, because Helen and David Chen had gradually begun to accept that their daughters might never come home and had started making tentative efforts to rebuild their lives while Marcus remained frozen in time. Unable to imagine a future that didn't include finding Emma and Lily, they had suggested family therapy and individual counseling for Marcus. But he had refused because he believed that accepting help would mean accepting defeat, and that any energy spent on healing himself was energy that should be devoted to the search. Instead, his parents watched helplessly as their son destroyed himself with guilt and obsession that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as time passed. The weight of carrying the search almost entirely alone had become crushing for Marcus, because while his parents and Detective Mitchell and a few close family friends still cared about finding Emma and Lily, the rest of the world had moved on to newer tragedies and more recent missing persons cases. The media attention that had been so intense during the first few months had faded completely, and the social media campaigns that had once generated thousands of shares and comments now reached only a handful of people who offered prayers and encouragement, but no concrete help or information. It felt like he was screaming into a void that absorbed his desperation and gave nothing back except silence. But despite the toll that 3 years of searching had taken on his physical and mental health, despite the financial ruin and social isolation and professional destruction that his obsession had caused, Marcus Chen had never wavered in his determination to find his sisters, because the alternative, accepting that Emma and Lily were gone forever, was simply unthinkable for a young man whose entire identity had been built around being their protector and who would rather spend the rest of his life searching than live with the knowledge that he had given up on the two people who had loved and trusted him most in the world. The morning of August 12th had dawned bright and clear, with the kind of perfect Colorado weather that seemed designed specifically for family adventures in the mountains. Marcus remembered it vividly because he had been awakened at dawn by the sound of his father loading camping gear into the blue Toyota 4Runner in the driveway below his bedroom window. The rhythmic thump of coolers and sleeping bags being arranged in the cargo area had pulled him from a deep sleep, and he had rolled over to check his phone, seeing that it was barely 6 in the morning on what was supposed to be a lazy Saturday. But David Chen had always been an early riser when it came to family trips, believing that getting an early start would allow them to make the most of their time in the wilderness. Marcus had stumbled downstairs in his pajamas to find his father in the kitchen, packing sandwiches and trail mix into a large cooler while humming an old Beatles song that Emma and Lily always teased him about because they said it made him sound like he was stuck in the past. David had looked up with a huge grin when Marcus appeared, rubbing his eyes and yawning like a bear emerging from hibernation morning sun. He had said with the kind of enthusiasm that only came out during family vacation, "Preparations. I know it's early, but I want to get to the campground before all the good spots are taken, and the girls are going to need time to get ready once they finally drag themselves out of bed. You know how they are with their hair and makeup, even when we're going camping." The relationship between David Chen and his twin daughters had always been something special to witness, because despite their 16 years, Emma and Lily still treated their father like he was the most important person in their world, and he responded to their attention and affection like a man who had won the lottery every single day. David had immigrated to the United States from Taiwan when he was 25 years old, with nothing but a suitcase and a determination to build a better life for the family he hoped to have someday. And when Emma and Lily were born, 2 minutes apart on a snowy February morning 18 years ago, he had cried with joy at the realization that he now had two perfect reasons to work harder and dream bigger than he had ever imagined possible. Marcus had always admired the way his father balanced being protective of his daughters while still encouraging their independence and adventurous spirits. David never missed a soccer game or school play or parent-teacher conference, and he had taught both girls how to change a tire and check their oil and defend themselves if they ever found themselves in dangerous situations. But he also respected their growing need for privacy and autonomy as they navigated the complicated transition from children to young women who were beginning to make their own decisions about friendships and activities and future plans that would eventually take them away from home. The camping trips had become even more precious to David as Emma and Lily entered their teenage years, because he recognized that their time as a close-knit family unit was limited, and that soon they would be too busy with jobs and college and romantic relationships to want to spend their weekends hiking through the mountains with their old-fashioned father, who still insisted on singing along to classic rock songs and telling embarrassing stories about their childhood adventures that made them roll their eyes and beg him to stop, but also made them laugh despite themselves, because they knew how much he loved sharing those memories with them. Emma had been the first to wake up that Saturday morning around 7:30, which was unusual for her because she typically slept until at least 10 on weekends. But the excitement of the camping trip and the knowledge that her father was already loading the car had pulled her from bed earlier than normal. Marcus had heard her moving around in the bathroom she shared with Lily, brushing her teeth and washing her face, and probably trying to decide how much makeup was acceptable for a wilderness adventure where she would be hiking and sleeping in a tent for 5 days. Emma had always been more concerned with her appearance than Lily, who was perfectly content to throw her hair in a ponytail and call it a day. Lily had emerged from their bedroom about 15 minutes later, already dressed in hiking boots and cargo shorts and a faded t-shirt from a national park they had visited the previous summer, her long dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, and her face free of makeup, except for the sunscreen their father insisted they wear whenever they spent time outdoors. Lily had always been the more practical of the twins and the more enthusiastic about outdoor activities, while Emma preferred shopping and movies and activities that allowed her to socialize with friends. But both girls loved spending time with their father and had never complained about the family camping trips, even when it meant missing parties or other social events. The breakfast conversation that morning had been filled with the kind of excited chatter that always preceded family adventures. David had spread topographical maps across the kitchen table and was showing Emma and Lily the hiking trails he wanted to explore while they ate pancakes and bacon that their mother Helen had prepared as a special send-off meal. The twins had been particularly interested in a trail that led to a waterfall about 3 miles from their planned campsite, because Lily wanted to practice her photography skills with her new camera, and Emma thought the waterfall would make a perfect backdrop for the selfies she planned to post on social media to make her friends jealous of her summer adventures. Marcus remembered feeling a twinge of regret that he wasn't joining them on this particular trip because he had made plans to spend the weekend studying for his graduate qualifying exams and working on a research project that was due the following week. But his father had been understanding about his academic commitments and had promised that there would be plenty of other opportunities for family camping trips once Marcus finished his degree and had more flexibility in his schedule. The twins had teased him about being a boring bookworm who preferred spreadsheets to sleeping bags, but they had also hugged him goodbye and made him promise to join them on the next adventure. Helen Chen had taken dozens of photographs that morning as her husband and daughters loaded the last of their supplies into the Toyota and prepared for their departure. She had always been the family documentarian, carefully preserving memories in photo albums and scrapbooks that chronicled every milestone and adventure and celebration, but she had also been fighting back tears as she watched them prepare to leave, because something about this particular trip felt different to her, though. She couldn't articulate exactly what was causing her uneasiness. She had attributed her anxiety to empty nest syndrome and the realization that Emma and Lily were growing up so fast. The final photograph Helen had taken showed David standing between Emma and Lily beside the loaded Toyota, all 3 of them grinning with anticipation for the adventure ahead. Emma had her arm around her father's waist, while Lily was making bunny ears behind his head with her fingers, and David was laughing at something one of them had said. The image captured a moment of pure family happiness and would later become the last photograph ever taken of the 3 of them together, a fact that would haunt Helen Chen for the rest of her life and make her wish she had taken 100 more pictures to preserve every possible second of that final morning. David had checked and double-checked their supplies multiple times before finally declaring that they were ready to leave. He had gone through his mental checklist out loud, as was his habit, making sure they had enough food and water for 5 days, along with first aid supplies, emergency flares, a satellite communication device that would allow them to call for help if cell phone coverage was unavailable, and all the camping equipment they would need to stay comfortable and safe in the wilderness. David had always been meticulous about safety preparations because he understood that the mountains could be dangerous even for experienced hikers and campers. The twins had climbed into the back seat of the Toyota with their backpacks and pillows, and the books and magazines they planned to read during quiet moments around the campfire. Emma had brought 3 different novels and a stack of fashion magazines, while Lily had packed field guides to Rocky Mountain wildlife and plants, along with her camera equipment and several notebooks where she recorded observations about the natural world that fascinated her so much. The contrast between their interests had always amused their parents, but also made them proud because it showed that their daughters were developing their own unique personalities and passions. Marcus had stood in the driveway waving goodbye as the Toyota pulled away from their house at exactly 9:15 that Saturday morning, which he remembered precisely because he had glanced at his watch and made a mental note to expect them home. By Tuesday evening, as planned, David had honked the horn twice as they turned the corner, which was his traditional farewell gesture, and Marcus had heard Emma and Lily laughing and calling out final goodbyes through the open windows, the sound of their voices growing fainter as they drove toward what should have been 5 days of hiking and storytelling and the kind of family bonding that creates memories to last a lifetime. The drive to Willow Creek Campground should have taken approximately 2.5 hours through scenic mountain roads that David knew well from previous family trips. The route would take them through the town of Estes Park, where they planned to stop for gas and snacks before entering Rocky Mountain National Park and following winding roads deeper into the wilderness where cell phone coverage became spotty and the nearest help could be miles away. But David had made this journey many times before and was confident in his ability to navigate the mountain roads safely, even with precious cargo in the form of his beloved daughters. The last communication anyone in the Chen family received from David, Emma, or Lily came at 9:47 that Saturday morning when David sent a text message to Marcus saying that they had stopped for gas in Estes Park and were making good time toward the campground. The message had included a photo of Emma and Lily standing beside a large wooden sign welcoming visitors to Rocky Mountain National Park. Both girls were smiling and giving thumbs-up gestures to the camera and appeared happy and excited about the adventure ahead, but that innocent photograph would later become evidence in a missing persons investigation and a haunting reminder of how quickly joy can turn to tragedy. The first 48 hours after Emma and Lily failed to return home had been a whirlwind of confusion and growing panic that Marcus would replay in his mind thousands of times over the next 3 years, searching for clues he might have missed or warning signs that could have prevented the tragedy that was about to unfold. Helen Chen had spent Tuesday evening, August 15th, pacing the living room and checking her phone every few minutes, expecting to hear David's familiar ringtone, announcing that they were on their way home, or perhaps running a little late because they had decided to take one more hike or had encountered heavy traffic on the mountain roads that frequently backed up during peak summer tourist season. When midnight came and went without any word from her husband and daughters, Helen had tried calling all 3 of their cell phones repeatedly, but each call went straight to voicemail, which wasn't entirely unusual given the poor cell coverage in many areas of Rocky Mountain National Park, but still felt ominous as the hours stretched on. Without any communication, she had considered calling the park rangers or local police, but had hesitated because David was a responsible father and experienced camper who would never put his daughters in danger. And she didn't want to embarrass her family by overreacting to what might be a simple case of dead batteries or extended hiking that had kept them away from their phones longer than expected. Wednesday morning had brought no relief from Helen's growing anxiety, and by noon she was calling Marcus every hour, asking if he had heard anything from their father or sisters. Marcus had tried to remain calm and reassuring, telling his mother that Dad was probably just enjoying the time with Emma and Lily and had lost track of time or decided to extend their stay because the weather was perfect and the girls were having such a wonderful time. But privately, he was beginning to share his mother's concern because David was usually very good about checking in with the family, especially when he was responsible for the safety of his teenage daughters in wilderness areas where anything could go wrong. By Wednesday afternoon, Helen's maternal instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong, and she finally called the Rocky Mountain National Park Ranger Station to report that her husband and twin daughters had failed to return from a camping trip as scheduled. The park ranger who took her call was professional and reassuring, explaining that delayed returns were common during peak season and that most missing camper reports were resolved within 24 hours when families turned up safe with stories of extended hikes or vehicle problems or simply having too much fun to want to come home on schedule. But he agreed to send rangers to check the Willow Creek campground where the Chen family had planned to stay. The discovery of David's abandoned Toyota 4Runner on Thursday morning, August 17th, had transformed a routine missing camper inquiry into a full-scale emergency search and rescue operation that would eventually involve hundreds of volunteers and multiple law enforcement agencies. The vehicle was found exactly where it should have been, in the parking area designated for campers using the Willow Creek site. But all of the family's camping equipment was still inside untouched, and there were no signs of the occupants anywhere in the immediate area, which immediately raised red flags for the experienced rangers who had seen countless camping mishaps over the years. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the condition of the campsite itself, which showed no evidence that anyone had ever used it. The reserved spot where David had planned to set up their tent was undisturbed, with no signs of camping equipment or a fire or any human activity, and none of the other campers in the area remembered seeing a man with twin teenage daughters, despite the fact that Emma and Lily were identical and striking enough that they usually attracted attention. Wherever they went, the complete absence of any trace of the Chen family's presence at the campground, where they had specifically reserved a spot for 5 days, was baffling to investigators and terrifying to the family members who were desperately hoping for logical explanations. The initial search efforts had been hampered by the vast wilderness area surrounding Willow Creek Campground and the multiple hiking trails that branched off in different directions, leading to dozens of possible destinations where the family might have gone. The search and rescue teams had focused first on the most popular trails, including the one leading to the waterfall that Emma and Lily had been excited about photographing. But despite using helicopters with thermal imaging equipment and search dogs trained to track human scent, the teams found no trace of David, Emma, or Lily on any of the established trails or in any of the areas where lost hikers were typically discovered. Marcus had joined the search efforts immediately upon learning that his family was missing, driving through the night to reach the campground and spending the next week hiking through wilderness areas, calling his sisters' names until his voice was hoarse and his feet were bleeding from traversing rough terrain in hiking boots that weren't properly broken. In the physical exhaustion and emotional toll of those first days of searching would pale in comparison to the years of anguish that followed. But at the time, Marcus had believed that finding Emma and Lily was simply a matter of covering enough ground and looking in the right places, because the alternative, that they had simply vanished without a trace, was too horrific to contemplate. The involvement of the FBI had brought additional resources and expertise to the search, but had also introduced the possibility that the Chen family's disappearance might involve foul play rather than a simple hiking accident or getting lost. In the wilderness, FBI agents had interviewed everyone who had been at Willow Creek Campground during the relevant time period, as well as employees at the gas station in Estes Park, where David had sent his final text message, but no one remembered seeing the distinctive blue Toyota or the man with identical twin daughters who should have been memorable to anyone who encountered them. The lack of any credible witnesses or physical evidence had led investigators to consider increasingly disturbing scenarios, including the possibility that David, Emma, and Lily had been abducted either from the campground or from some location along their route, but the complete absence of signs of struggle or any demands from potential kidnappers made this theory difficult to support. With concrete evidence, the FBI had also investigated David's background and finances, looking for any indication that he might have enemies or debts that could have motivated an attack on his family. But David Chen was universally described as a quiet, hard-working man with no known enemies and no involvement in any activities that would have put his family at risk. The media attention during the first few months had been intense, with local and national news outlets covering the story of the missing family and broadcasting photographs of David, Emma, and Lily across the country. The images of the smiling twins, had been particularly compelling to viewers and had generated thousands of tips from people who thought they had seen the girls in locations ranging from nearby Colorado cities to states as far away as California and Florida, but every single tip had been investigated thoroughly by law enforcement, and none had produced any credible evidence of the family's whereabouts or fate. Marcus had appeared on multiple television programs during those early months, pleading for information about his missing family members and offering reward money that the Chen family had scraped together by borrowing against their home and liquidating their savings accounts. The interviews had been emotionally devastating for Marcus, who had never been comfortable speaking publicly, but had forced himself to endure the spotlight because he believed that media coverage was the best hope for generating leads that might bring Emma and Lily home safely. The gradual decline in media interest had been almost as painful as the original disappearance, because it felt like the world was forgetting about Emma and Lily and moving on to newer tragedies and more recent missing persons cases. Marcus had fought desperately to keep the story in the public eye by creating social media campaigns and organizing community search efforts and maintaining a website dedicated to finding his sisters. But despite his efforts, the case had gradually faded from public consciousness as months turned into years without any significant developments or new evidence. The private investigators that Marcus had hired over the years had each brought different theories and approaches to the case, but none had been able to make meaningful progress towards solving the mystery of what had happened to the Chen family. The first investigator had focused on the possibility that David, Emma, and Lily had encountered criminals in the national park and had been killed and buried in remote locations, but extensive searches of areas where bodies might be concealed had turned up nothing. The second investigator had pursued the theory that the family had been abducted and taken out of state. But months of following paper trails and interviewing contacts in other regions had produced no useful leads. The third private investigator had been the most expensive and had claimed expertise in cases involving missing families, but had ultimately provided nothing more than theories and speculation that Marcus could have developed himself through internet research. The experience of being exploited by people who preyed on desperate families had left Marcus even more cynical and isolated, but had not diminished his determination to continue searching, because he knew that somewhere in the vast puzzle of evidence and possibilities was the key to understanding what had really happened to Emma and Lily on that August morning when they had driven away from home forever. The physical searches of wilderness areas had continued for over 2 years, with volunteers and family members combing through thousands of acres of Rocky Mountain terrain, looking for any sign of the missing family members. But the vastness of the search area and the harsh mountain environment that could quickly eliminate evidence made the task nearly impossible, even with sophisticated equipment and experienced search teams. The frustration of covering the same ground repeatedly without finding any trace of David, Emma, or Lily had gradually worn down even the most dedicated volunteers, until Marcus was often searching alone, carrying photographs of his sisters and enough supplies to sustain him through multi-day expeditions into areas where few people ever ventured. The toll that 3 years of failed searches and false hopes and crushing disappointments had taken on the entire Chen family was evident in every aspect of their daily lives. Helen had developed severe anxiety and depression that required medication and therapy, and David's parents, who had flown in from Taiwan to help with the search efforts, had returned home after 6 months, convinced that their son and granddaughters were dead, and that continuing to search was preventing the family from accepting reality and beginning to heal from their loss. But Marcus had remained steadfast in his refusal to give up hope, because he believed that somewhere Emma and Lily were waiting for him to find them and bring them home where they belonged. The phone call that would change everything came on a cold Tuesday morning in November, 3 years and 3 months After Emma and Lily had vanished into the Colorado wilderness, Marcus was sitting at his computer in the makeshift command center. He had created in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by maps and missing person flyers and photographs, when his cell phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, because over the years he had received hundreds of calls from cranks and scammers and well-meaning but confused people who thought they had seen his sisters. But something about the timing of this particular call made him pick up on the fourth ring. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who identified herself as Rebecca Torres, a social worker from Denver, who said she had been following Emma and Lily's case since the beginning and had something important to tell Marcus about what had really happened to his sisters. The woman's tone was serious and urgent, but also compassionate in a way that made Marcus pay attention rather than immediately hanging up, as he had learned to do with most unsolicited calls about the case. She asked if he could meet her in person that afternoon at a coffee shop in downtown Boulder, because what she had to tell him was too sensitive and important to discuss over the phone. Marcus felt his heart racing as he agreed to the meeting, because after 3 years of dead ends and false leads, he had almost given up hope that anyone would ever come forward with real information about Emma and Lily's disappearance. But something about Rebecca Torres's voice and the specificity of her request made him believe that this might finally be the breakthrough he had been praying for every night since that terrible August morning when his family had driven away and never returned. He spent the rest of the morning pacing around the house and checking his watch every few minutes until it was time to drive to the coffee shop. Rebecca Torres was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes, who looked exactly like what Marcus had imagined a social worker would look like, professional but warm, with the kind of face that encouraged people to trust her with their secrets and pain. She was already seated at a corner table when Marcus arrived, and she stood up to shake his hand before gesturing for him to sit down across from her in the booth that would give them privacy for what she clearly expected to be a difficult conversation about his missing sisters. What Rebecca told Marcus over the next 2 hours would shatter everything he thought he knew about his father and force him to confront the possibility that the man he had idolized his entire life had been living a double life that ultimately led to tragedy for Emma and Lily. She explained that she had been working with a young woman named Ashley Chen, who had been trafficked as a teenager and had recently aged out of the foster care system where she had been placed after being rescued from her captors 3 years earlier. Ashley had been reluctant to talk about her experiences, but had finally opened up about what had happened to her, and specifically about the man who had been responsible for her kidnapping. According to Ashley's account, she had been approached by David Chen at a shopping mall in Denver, where she had been hanging out with friends during the summer before her senior year of high school. David had seemed like a kind older man who was concerned about her welfare and had offered to give her a ride home when she mentioned that her friends had left without her. But instead of taking her home, he had driven her to a remote location where other men were waiting, and she had been forced into a trafficking ring that moved teenage girls across state lines for the commercial sex trade. Ashley had described David Chen in perfect detail, including the blue Toyota 4Runner he had been driving, and his distinctive accent and mannerisms that Marcus recognized immediately as belonging to his father. But what made her account even more credible was her ability to describe Emma and Lily, whom she said she had seen briefly on the day she was rescued by federal agents in a raid on a house in Wyoming, where multiple trafficking victims were being held. Ashley remembered the twins, specifically because they had been crying and calling for their father, and because they looked so young and scared and out of place among the other girls who had been in captivity much longer. Rebecca explained that Ashley had been too traumatized to speak about her experiences immediately after her rescue, and had spent months in therapy before she was able to provide a coherent account of what had happened to her. But when she finally did start talking, she had specifically asked about Emma and Lily Chen because she remembered their names and was haunted by the knowledge that they might still be trapped in the same trafficking ring that had destroyed her own life. Ashley had been following the missing persons case through news reports and social media, and had finally decided to come forward because she couldn't live with the guilt of knowing information that might help bring the twins home. Marcus felt like the world was spinning around him as he tried to process what Rebecca was telling him, because the idea that his father could be involved in human trafficking was so completely at odds with everything he knew about David Chen that it seemed impossible to believe. But Ashley's detailed description and her knowledge of facts that had never been made public convinced Marcus that she was telling the truth about having encountered his family under circumstances that were too specific and too horrific to be coincidental or fabricated by someone seeking attention or money. The social worker explained that Ashley had been reluctant to contact law enforcement directly because she was afraid that her criminal record from the time she spent under the control of traffickers would make her testimony unreliable, and because she was terrified of retaliation from the people who had enslaved her. But she had agreed to speak with Marcus because she believed that he deserved to know the truth about what had happened to his sisters, even if that truth was more devastating than anything he had imagined during 3 years of wondering and searching and hoping for answers. Rebecca handed Marcus a manila envelope containing photographs and documents that Ashley had provided, including pictures she had taken with a hidden cell phone during her captivity that showed Emma and Lily in the background of images that were too disturbing for Marcus to look at for more than a few seconds, but that clearly proved that his sisters had been alive and in the custody of human traffickers at least 6 months after their disappearance from the Colorado campground, where their father's vehicle had been found abandoned with all their camping equipment still inside, untouched. The revelation that David Chen had not been a victim but rather a perpetrator completely reframed everything that Marcus thought he knew about the case, and explained why 3 years of searching wilderness areas and following leads about random abductions had produced no results. His father had not taken Emma and Lily camping in Rocky Mountain National Park. He had delivered them to criminals who specialized in exploiting vulnerable young people for profit and had staged their disappearance to look like a hiking accident or random crime that would focus law enforcement attention in completely the wrong direction. Marcus asked Rebecca why Ashley was coming forward now after 3 years of silence, and learned that the young woman had recently discovered through social media that the Chen family was still actively searching for Emma and Lily and offering reward money for information about their whereabouts. Ashley had been consumed with guilt, knowing that she possessed information that could help solve the case, but had been too afraid and traumatized to speak up until her therapist had helped her understand that remaining silent was causing additional harm to people who were already suffering, and that speaking the truth might help prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The social worker provided Marcus with contact information for federal agents who were familiar with Ashley's case and who had been investigating the trafficking ring that had held her captive, but she warned him that the process of pursuing justice would be long and difficult, and that there was no guarantee that Emma and Lily were still alive or could be located even with Ashley's testimony. As a starting point, the trafficking organization had been sophisticated and well connected with the resources to move victims across international borders and the ability to eliminate people who posed threats to their operations. Rebecca also explained that Ashley would need extensive support and protection if she decided to cooperate with law enforcement, because testifying against human traffickers was extremely dangerous and could put her life at risk. But the young woman had decided that she was willing to take that risk if it meant helping to find Emma and Lily and bringing their father and his accomplices to justice for the crimes they had committed against multiple families and countless young victims. who had been bought and sold like merchandise by people who viewed human suffering as a business opportunity. Marcus left the coffee shop that afternoon with his entire worldview shattered and his understanding of his own family completely transformed. But for the first time in 3 years, he also felt something that had been missing from his life since. Emma and Lily disappeared hope that he might finally be able to find his sisters and bring them home, even if the truth about their disappearance was more horrific than anything he had ever imagined, the knowledge that they had been alive months. After vanishing gave him reason to believe that they might still be alive somewhere, waiting for their big brother to find them and rescue them from the nightmare their own father had sold them into, for reasons that Marcus would probably never understand. If this story has moved you and you want to stay updated on cases like these, where families never give up searching for their missing loved ones, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, because every share and every viewer helps keep these stories alive, and sometimes that attention is exactly what leads to the breakthrough that brings someone home to their family who has been waiting and hoping and refusing to give up for years.